Okay, so you guys sent in a bunch of articles all about the Houthis, and wow, talk about perfect timing with the U.S. just slapping that terrorist designation on them again. Seems like things are about to get even more messy over there.
Yeah, you could say that. It's a really tangled web, you know? Like you start pulling on one thread and suddenly you're dealing with like international relations, regional conflicts, all sorts of strategic maneuvering.
You're not kidding.
Yeah.
But before we get ahead of ourselves,
Yeah.
this isn't the first time this has happened, right? I mean, the whole terrorist organization label
Yeah,
thing.
you are. This actually goes all the way back to Trump, his first term.
Okay, yeah.
2020, he put that designation on them, but then Biden reversed it in 2021, figured it'd help get humanitarian aid into Yemen easier.
Makes sense. So what changed? Like what happened that made them decide to put it back in place?
Well, officially, the White House says it's because the Houthis are a threat to civilians, U.S. personnel, and just regional stability in general. But, looking at these articles you sent, seems like those attacks they did on ships in the Red Sea, that was a big factor.
Yeah, I remember reading about those. They were targeting international shipping routes, right? What was the strategy there, you think?
Good question. I mean, on the surface, it just seems kind of reckless, right? Like a really bold move. But when you think about how tight the Houthis are with Iran, it starts to make a little more sense.
They're,
Iran and the U.S., they have this whole long history of tension. And, anytime you go after a group that's seen as an Iranian proxy, it's going to make waves.
oh, for sure. So by attacking those ships, were the Houthis like flexing their muscles, kind of showing they're not just a player in Yemen, but like on a global scale?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. It's a total power play. Sends a message to everyone involved, US, Saudi Arabia, even Iran. They're basically saying, hey, we're here, we're capable, and we're not afraid to take anyone on.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. But let's not forget about the people who are caught in the middle of all of this. What about the humanitarian situation in Yemen? Biden took the terrorist label off before because he was worried about blocking aid.
Right. And now that worries back. Aid groups are already saying this redesignation could make it even tougher to get supplies into Yemen. It's already a humanitarian crisis there. It's a real dilemma, isn't it? Trying to put the squeeze on the Houthis, but also making sure innocent people don't get punished in the process.
Sounds like they're walking a tightrope. Speaking of precarious situations, what about the potential for this to, escalate the conflict, make things even worse?
Absolutely. One of the articles you sent, an expert was quoted in it. He said this was basically inevitable because of those attacks on ships. It was already pretty tense before, with the U.S. and their allies in this coalition called the Prosperity Guard carrying out airstrikes against the Houthis.
Hang on, Prosperity Guard. Can you remind our listeners about that?
Sure, yeah. It's basically a coalition led by Saudi Arabia. It was formed back in 2015 to try to push back against the Houthis and put the previous government back in place. They've been involved in the conflict since the beginning.
Got it. Thanks for that. So you're saying that with this designation, the U.S. and the Prosperity Guard might feel like they have more justification to, ramp things up, get even more aggressive.
It's definitely a possibility. And then, of course, that raises the question of how will the Houthis respond?
I can't imagine they're just going to sit back and take it.
You're right about that. I mean, one Houthi leader was already quoted saying that this designation isn't new and it won't have any impact. He even said, "Death to America," their slogan, Shows how much animosity there is. I think some kind of retaliation from the Houthis is pretty much guaranteed.
Okay, so we've got potential for a humanitarian disaster, possible military escalation. Is there any room left for diplomacy? Does this just kill any chance of negotiations?
Well, that's the big question, especially because there's been talk of a new nuclear agreement between the U.S. and Iran.
All right. Right.
So this has been going on for years now, back and forth, about Iran's nuclear program. The U.S. and other countries are worried Iran might be trying to make nuclear weapons. Iran says they're not. There have been agreements, sanctions, and now there's talk of a new deal.
Okay, so how does that connect to the Houthis?
Well, one expert, he was saying that this designation might be more symbolic than anything else, like not a huge policy shift, but it could still make things more complicated. He said that if the U.S. and Iran actually do manage to make this nuclear deal, then regional issues, stuff like the Yemen conflict, could be part of some bigger negotiation.
So there's a chance, maybe the tiny one.
Yeah.
But what about the people in Yemen? What are they saying about all of this?
Well, one Yemeni professor, he's a political science professor, he said he's really worried about another round of conflict, like it's imminent. He pointed out that the whole situation has just gotten so complex. There are so many layers of conflict intertwined. Specifically, he mentioned the Arab coalition's intervention, the Red Sea attacks, and even the strikes between the Houthis and Israel. It's a lot.
It's really heartbreaking to think about how people's lives are being affected by all of this. So we've got the U.S. designation, the humanitarian crisis, the potential for escalation, and this possible link to the U.S. and Iran.
And we can't forget the Houthis' involvement in the Gaza conflict, too. That's another layer of complexity we need to talk about.
Oh, you're right. That's where things get even more interesting
Hmm.
and complicated. Let's dive into that next.
Yeah, the Houthis getting involved in the Gaza conflict really changed things. They launched something like 300 attacks on targets linked to Israel and the U.S., all in the Red Sea. It's a major escalation, taking their fight way beyond Yemen.
300 attacks. Wow, that's a huge number. Hard to imagine, really. What were they hoping to achieve by getting involved in this bigger international conflict?
Well, it's definitely a calculated move. I think on the one hand, it shows solidarity with the Palestinians, aligning themselves with a cause that a lot of people in the Muslim world really care about. It also lets them show off their power, their influence. It goes beyond Yemen and shows everyone they're a force to be reckoned with.
So it's about more than just Yemen, right? They're trying to make a statement about their role in the whole region. Do we know if these attacks actually had much of an impact on the situation in Gaza?
It's tough to say for sure. I mean, Gaza's a really complex situation with tons of different factors. But there was this one journalist, he writes about military affairs, and he suggested that the U.S. might be underestimating the Houthis, their capabilities and their tactics. He even said that maybe this terrorist designation is a way for the U.S. to put more pressure on them, like maybe target more of their infrastructure or even go after their leaders.
That's pretty scary. It feels like things could easily spiral out of control, into a much bigger conflict. And the Houthis don't seem to be backing down either. I read a quote from their spokesperson, and he basically said their involvement was effective and that the Palestinian cause is the most important thing they're fighting for.
Right, and that's where you see how this all connects back to the terrorist designation. By getting involved in Gaza and attacking international shipping, the Houthis are showing they're committed to their cause. They're defying the U.S. and its allies. They're basically saying, you can call us terrorists, but we're not going anywhere, and we're going to keep fighting for what we believe in.
So maybe instead of scaring them off, this designation is actually making them more determined,
Mhm.
pushing them to do even more extreme things. I mean, what does this mean for the Yemeni people who are already dealing with years of war and a humanitarian crisis?
It's a terrible situation. They're caught in the middle, and their lives are being completely disrupted by these power struggles. It's important to remember that even within Yemen, people have a lot of different perspectives on the conflict. It's not just one simple story. Understanding those different viewpoints is really key if we want to find any kind of solution.
You mentioned earlier that things in Yemen are super complex with all these different layers of conflict. Can you break that down a bit more?
Absolutely. It's like trying to untangle a huge knot. You've got the internal fighting within Yemen itself, with all these different groups fighting for power. Then you've got the regional rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, both of them trying to control the area. And then, of course, you have the U.S. with its interests in the Middle East trying to keep things stable and counter Iran's influence.
And now the Houthis are involved in Gaza, which just adds another layer to this already confusing situation. It feels like any little thing could set off a chain reaction and nobody knows what'll happen.
Exactly, and that's why understanding the whole picture is so important. This whole Houthi situation, it's like a microcosm of the challenges we see all over the world. Conflicts that are all connected, alliances that are always changing, and this constant battle for power and control. There are no easy answers, and every decision comes with a risk.
So where do we go from here? With the Houthis digging in, the U.S. getting tougher, and the Yemeni people caught in the middle, what are some of the possible outcomes here?
That's the million-dollar question, and one we're going to really explore in the last part of our deep dive. We'll look at the potential scenarios for this conflict, what it means for the future of Yemen and the whole region, really.
So we've talked a lot about the Houthis' recent moves, the U.S. calling them terrorists, and the whole regional and international mess that's going on. But the big question is, what happens to Yemen? How do we even start to figure this out?
Yeah, that's the question everyone's asking themselves, the experts and the people trying to make decisions. It's like this giant chess game with all these players, and every move could change everything.
So what are some of the scenarios of what could actually happen?
Okay, so let's start with the best case scenario, even though it's probably a long shot. What if there's some kind of negotiated settlement? If the U.S. and Iran actually get that nuclear deal done,
Yeah.
maybe that opens the door to talking about other stuff, like the conflict in Yemen. But everybody would have to be willing to give up some things, and that's a lot to ask after all this time and all the freighting.
Yeah. A peaceful solution would be amazing.
Yeah.
But after all the bloodshed, it's hard to imagine. What are some of the other, maybe more realistic possibilities?
Well, the more likely scenario is that the fighting just keeps going, and it could even get worse.
Oh,
Now that the U.S. is officially calling the Houthis terrorists, they might feel like they can do more militarily. We've already seen those airstrikes from the U.S. and their allies, and those could get even more intense. And of course, that means more suffering for the Yemeni people.
and the Houthis, I mean, how are they going to react to that? It's already shown they're not afraid to fight back.
Exactly. They're tough. They've learned how to be really resourceful, even though they're fighting against a much stronger military force. And they have Iran backing them up. Plus, their weapons are getting more advanced. If this turns into a full-on war, it would be devastating for Yemen. It could destabilize the whole region and maybe even drag other countries into the fight.
That's a scary thought. Is there anything that can be done to stop that from happening?
Yeah.
Is there any hope for Yemen?
There's always hope. One thing to watch is what happens with international diplomacy. The UN has been trying really hard to get everyone to the table for peace talks.
Right.
Maybe if there's enough pressure from the rest of the world, it could force the different sides to work out some kind of agreement. But it can't just be talk. There have to be real actions to fix the problems that started this whole conflict in the first place.
So Yemen's future is hanging in the balance. As we wrap up our deep dive, what are the most important things we should be looking out for? What should our listener be paying attention to as this situation develops?
Keep an eye on the U.S. and Iran. See if they make any progress on that nuclear deal. That could have a big impact on what happens in Yemen. Also, watch what Saudi Arabia and the Arab coalition do. Are they actually serious about peace talks? And don't forget about what's going on inside Yemen itself. Any changes in who's in charge or who's allied with who could change the whole direction of the conflict.
So much to think about. It's easy to get lost in all the details, but you've given us a really helpful way to understand this conflict and what might happen next. Any final thoughts for our listener before we go?
It's important to remember that even with all the politics and the fighting, there are real people whose lives have been completely turned upside down by this war. The Yemeni people deserve peace, and we need to listen to what they're saying. We can all do our part by staying informed, talking about this with each other, and supporting solutions that put people first and aim for peace.
This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. It's helped us understand a conflict that is often oversimplified in the news. Thank you for helping us make sense of it all and for reminding us about the human cost of this war. To our listeners, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep looking at this from different angles. The situation in Yemen is always changing, and understanding all the details is really important if we want to find our way through this.